Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is part 2 of a special Middle East edition of City Talk with Richard Murphy, former U.S. ambassador to Mauritania, Syria, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia. He has served as Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for Near Eastern and Asian Affairs and has been named Career Ambassador. He is a frequent TV commentator and widely consulted expert. Like all good serial soap operas, we need to take a minute to review what we did last week. Last week we talked about Iraq and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We'll pick up there and then move to Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Lebanon. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
Last week we had ended with a discussion of the factors involved in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and looking at what might happen. What is out there right now that could break this conflict? Is there something out there?
Something positive? You mean?
Yes, absolutely.
No, I think there is. And let me go back to something I recall saying last week. I was quoting what an Iraqi had said about the way things had gone badly in their country. And he came back into the conversation right near the end, and he said, look, I hope we Iraqis are not going to fall into the pit either of despotism or foreign occupation. You, referring to me, this Iraqi was saying, you said that you acknowledged we were changing and we were changing slowly. I think that's fair, but why can't you Americans accept that Hamas is changing? Maybe it's too slow for you, but accept the fact they are changing. And that's in keeping with their capacities. They've had a fixed position. Now they're showing signs of moving from that fixed position. But if you insist on meeting literally, word for word, your demands, your 3 demands, which were recognizing all former agreements and renouncing violence and accepting Israel's right to exist, they're going to find it difficult to say those things. Now, what's positive, I think, is that the new player, he's not new, but he's more assertive now, the Saudi player, in the person of King Abdullah, has brought Hamas and Fatah together in Mecca and worked out some kind of understanding. Maybe America isn't very pleased with that understanding, that it looks like Fatah didn't prevail, that Hamas got the most of the points in that discussion. But they are working towards a new government. And at the same time, the Saudis are going to table once again what they did 5 years ago in Beirut, at the Arab Summit in Beirut, when they said that all Arab countries would normalize relations with Israel if it withdrew to the 67 lines and worked out a fair solution for the Palestinian problem. The pre-war line, just before the Six-Day War in 67. What's happened is the Arabs have moved from the position of total rejection of Israel, which was the case back in 67, to an acceptance of Israel, provided the 67 lines are accepted by Israel. Now, that's not going to be easy for Israel, although they've come very close to that. They got out of the Sinai Peninsula. They worked out an agreement with Jordan. The former Prime Minister Ehud Barak reached an agreement apparently with Syria, which returned all of the Golan to Syria except for a very thin strip, a few hundred yards around the Sea of Galilee, around Kinneret. Now, the Israelis for years used to joke about the Palestinians that was one people that never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Hey, you can say the same thing about the Israelis when it came to that original proposition back in 2002. That proposition will be remade apparently at this upcoming summit in the Arab world.
What do you expect the reaction to be, the Israeli reaction?
Some say the Israeli government, the present government, is too weak to get into peace negotiations, that it just doesn't have enough support. Well, I say the Israeli people are very interested in peace. And even though the government is, as it often has been in the past, fragmented and cantankerous within.
It's a functioning democracy.
It's a functioning democracy, and the people have made their desires very clear. They would like an acceptable deal. They want a peaceful life to get on with the life of Israel.
And the pre-67 borders would allow Israel to exist economically and militarily in terms of security and not endanger their vital interests?
Well, that is the meaning in my book of normalizing relations. Now, if they suspect the Arab intentions, you're only going to work that out in negotiations. Some say the Arabs can never make peace. They could give, as Arafat once promised, a long-term open-ended truce for many, many years. Maybe they can't sign a peace treaty. I don't know, but they haven't been put to the test in recent years. The Israelis unfortunately officially laughed at that proposition 5 years ago. I hope we're not going to see a repeat of that.
Is there what has been the United States' role, and what could it be, and what should it be?
The United States' role in earlier years has been telling off the Europeans, more or less politely, telling off the UN, stand aside. This is an American peace process. We have contact with all of the players. We're the only power that does, and I'm talking about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Mm-hmm. And you're just going to mess it up. We'll run it. We're the honest broker. I don't think we can play that role. I mean, that's my personal feeling anymore. We're not seen as an honest broker anymore. I think we have to move in concert with the Europeans, maybe with the Russians, the quartet that was put together in the early part of the Bush administration and hasn't really done much since.
And the quartet is?
Well, it's the U.S., the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations, okay, represented by the Secretary General.
So you are very cautiously not pessimistic about the situation.
I think it's going to be tough because I think it would have been easier with leaders who are no longer with us, such as Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, among others, Hafiz al-Assad. Their successors don't have the control and the ability to move their publics. So
you've got interacting weak governments that can't move, whether they're authoritarian or democratic.
And none of them are going to accept a diktat from Washington, from Europe, from the UN. No, but let's see what sitting down at this table, the magic table, can do for a change.
Okay. There's been a lot going on over the last month. In fact, last weekend, the Iranian president met with King Abdullah. And what was the nature, what were the goals of the discussion? What were the outcomes of the discussion? What's the significance?
Well, neither the goals or the outcome are very clear at this point. We know that King Abdullah has been very uneasy with the situation of the Sunnis in Iraq.
Well, in fact, threatened to support them if the U.S. withdrew.
Well, you know, back in January, Vice President Cheney made a very quick trip to Riyadh.
Yes.
Apparently at the Saudis' insistence. And it looks as if the message was, don't pull out abruptly, it's too fragile. We've got to find a way to calm things down before you leave. Now, just how that was put, I don't know, but I think that may well have been the principal message. The king was in part responding to his own conservative elements, more conservative than he is as the leader, within Saudi Arabia, that have been talking about a massacre by Shia of the Sunni brothers in Iraq. So yeah, he has to watch that situation. There's also a suspicion on the part of Jordan, Egypt, Sunni leaders in the Persian Gulf states that Iran is trying to exert a much greater authority and influence over the whole region. I think personally Iran's limitations are pretty clear. It is a Shiite, not a Sunni majority state. It's not one of the majority of the Arab states or the Muslim world. But they have been elevated to a new power position, in part by our killing off the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq.
So another one of our famous laws of perverse consequence comes about.
Yeah.
Okay. In December, Abdullah called the situation in the Arab world, quote, a powder keg waiting for a spark to explode. What could be that spark?
The spark could come from the fire that is already lit in Iraq. Mm-hmm. It could come from the standoff in Lebanon, distant, as you could say, from the main problems, but a bellwether that could erupt into flames between the Shiite Hezbollah and the Sunni government. They've been at odds for 3 months now since the Shia ministers resigned. Mm-hmm. It could come from a Palestinian civil war. All three worries are on his mind. Also the Iranian nuclear program.
Well, clearly you've got two regional powers, if you will, Saudi Arabia and Iran, attempting to check one another, both politically, militarily, etc. But there's a need to talk because, in a sense, both have an interest in averting a U.S.-Iran conflict, no?
Yes. I mean, the Middle East is like a kaleidoscope. At the moment, the Iranians in their own country have a very loud, clear voice, great influence in Iraq at the moment. By extension, in Lebanon, in their support for Hezbollah, thanks to Syrian assistance, getting Iranian weapons and training and money to Hezbollah. And Secretary Rice spoke a couple months ago in a way that probably made her audience quite uneasy. She talked of the new alliance between America and the moderate Arabs of the Arab world.
It's like a death sentence.
Well, they don't like being identified by non-Arabs as friends of the United States. Yeah.
I don't want to get into a discussion of Secretary Rice as a Secretary of State, but she's made a habit, or not a habit, has often said things that really have exacerbated the situation. I recall one quote regarding Lebanon that, that civil war was somehow something positive and opening.
Well, that with the fire burning in Iraq, I think she did make a comment last summer that as the Israeli move against southern Lebanon was underway and the bombings up and down the Lebanese scene were happening, that, well, we're witnessing the birth pangs of a new Middle East. Now that went over like a lead balloon in the today's Middle East.
Do you know, and does it matter what folks think of her as Secretary of State in terms of her own personal cachet, if you will? Or is it just simply derivative from her position?
Well, it matters certainly what she says, and she is seen as a very close advisor and a person with considerable influence in foreign policy over President Bush and an influence on his thinking. So they welcomed her appointment as secretary. Secretary Powell hadn't enjoyed that relationship, so when she came in, a Secretary of State is not an independent power. It's what it has the authority, she or he as secretary has the authority that the president gives. And so there was some feeling that she would make a change, or she'd bring about a change in the American policy. And I think you can see that there have been changes in the decision to go to talks with the North Koreans. We've apparently had bilateral talks. While stating we weren't going to have bilateral talks, we were having them. And that's since she came into the job. So she has made a difference. The Middle East has not been her specialty professionally over the years.
She's
a Soviet specialist, yeah.
Okay. Let's go to Iran. You noted earlier Tehran's growing influence in the region, and in some sense, Iran is at the center of the Middle East's problems, whether it's the civil war in Iraq, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Palestine. They've become a central player here.
Much more active player than had been the case in the early days of the Iranian Revolution.
What are they after? I mean, is this nationalistic? Is it ideological, religious? I know it's simplistic to talk about it in these terms, but are we looking at sort of a traditional Persian power, or are we looking at something else here? Are we exporting ideology as well? Or can you separate them?
You can't really separate them. Even in the Ayatollah Khomeini's day, he made pretty clear how much Iranian national interests mattered to him, along with saying, I am the only Muslim leader who is truly fit to rule. All these others are corrupt and should be disposed of, should be put out by their own people. And he was giving help to some other people to do just that in the first decade of the Iranian Revolution. Mm-hmm. Now, I think Iran is looking for something that's hard to quantify, but call it respect. That may be the main drive behind its nuclear program.
Right.
But whether they are aiming and whether they will ever get to having a nuclear weapon, I don't know. They may stop, they may be forced to stop, they may be whatever. But they are looking for respect and recognition as a main player in the Middle East, particularly in the Persian Gulf and, of course, in their immediate neighbor of Iraq. Mm-hmm. The famous so-called alliance between between Iran and Syria is an alliance of some convenience to both sides. But there's a lot of differences between the outlook in Damascus and that in Tehran. They've used each other. But they want to be seen and consulted and worked with as a major power in the area. And the reality is they are a big power in the area.
And the nuclear weapon will make them certainly more of a power. Does that trigger an arms race in the Middle East, where now the Saudis and whoever else is now looking for nuclear weapons as a deterrent, if you will?
Well, that's a very clear possibility. You had the Arab leaders from the Gulf Cooperation Council, led by Saudi Arabia, talk about the need to explore nuclear energy themselves. The Egyptians, who had put their program aside years ago, are talking about it again. They see it as a political, not just security issue, that if the Iranians have a major weapon system and they don't, then they're going to be subject to pressures and influence. Is anybody seriously worried about being hit by an Iranian nuclear bomb? I think the Israelis are. But, the Iranians, I'm sure, are clever enough to recognize that if they were to use a bomb, such a weapon against Israel, they would be flattened themselves, and they would have wiped out the Palestinian population at the same time as the Israeli, if they were stupid enough to use a bomb.
U.S.-Iran relations, what do we need from them to either do or desist from doing, and what do they need from us to do or desist from doing that can at least begin a process of accommodation, if you will?
Well, it certainly would be nice if they would agree to suspend their nuclear enrichment program as talks went on, but I think it's unrealistic when somebody feels he has a real lever in such a program to say, just give it up or suspend it as we talk, or before we talk. We made that a condition even on our meeting and our talking. Now that seems to be dropping away, and we will meet with Iran, we will meet with Syria in a conference about Iraq in the coming weeks.
What does Iran want out of or in Iraq? What would be in their, what do they perceive to be, as much as you can determine, their perception of their national interest in Iraq?
Certainly, at one extreme, an Iraq which never again is a threat to them as Saddam Hussein was. Let's not forget the devastation to the population of both countries that resulted from his launching the war, which continued because of their refusal to accept a ceasefire, but he did start it. He did start the troubles. And hundreds of thousands died and were maimed in the Iraq-Iran war in the first decade after the Iranian Revolution.
So what do we want from them in Iraq?
Well, a policy which works to reconcile, as we're trying to do, the Sunni and the Shia of Iraq.
And is that in their interest?
It is in their interest, because they've got no interest, nor does any one of the neighbors in reality have an interest in the breakup of Iraq, in the further destruction of that country, and conceivably partition of that country, because that would trigger demands and moves by each of the neighbors in turn, be they Turks or Saudis or Syrians, Iranians, to move in ways which are today unpredictable. So
what I'm hearing is that the policy of containment that we've had with Iran, in a sense, should be, that the paradigm should rather be more of détente, engagement, talking, discussion of mutual interests, etc. And you see that happening? And is that an apt characterization?
I hope, well, it's an apt characterization of what we would like to see, I believe. But we're just at the beginning, and we will see how it works. It's not, of course, entirely in our power. I don't know the Iranians that well. Let's see how they behave at the table. But we did, let's not forget, we did, as Americans, American government, work with Iran before the invasion of Afghanistan. Right. We worked with Iran, or they stood aside very happily as we invaded Iraq. They didn't cause problems then. And today the main problems our troops are facing are coming from the Iraqi Sunni side. 70–80% of the incidents are theirs, compared to what the troubles hitting us from the Shia side. So they can play a significant role in calming things down in Iraq as we move ahead and work with all of them.
So there's clear mutuality of interest here.
I think there is.
How you get to a substantive agreement on how to effectuate that is obviously the problem.
It does mean a psychological shift on our side to accept the fact that they are a neighbor of Iraq, and with a significant capability in Iraqi politics, in the economy. You know, we even objected to announcements that they were doing some investments in building hospitals and schools in Iraq. Well, hey, they have their idea of how to use their economic potential like we do. Sure. So let's see if we can't work together on it.
So I'm trying to get this picture of the Middle East, which is extraordinarily difficult. That's why I love talking with you. Is that Iran, sort of focusing on Iran, Iran is Shia. The rest of the governing states are Sunni. So you've got a conflict there.
Iraq is Shia. A majority of the population in the small state of Bahrain is Shia.
Okay.
And a plurality, or I guess something like 40% of Lebanon is Shia.
Okay, so you've got that element there in terms of regional conflict, if you will, and flashpoints. Yeah. Also, is there an Arab versus Persian element to this that transcends, or at least undergirds, whatever the proper word is, the conflicts and the concerns?
There is the Arab-Persian conflict, certainly. It may have started as religious because you Sunnis killed our leader, whom we revere, and we will never forget his death at your hands back in the 7th century. And the cult of the martyrdom that we often hear about is still alive. But I think we have to be careful not to read too much of the ancient history, or at least the 1st century of Islam, into how to deal with today's problems. People want to cast it in religious terms. But there is a power struggle underway, and be they Palestinians rivals with each other, is it between Iran and U.S. in playing with the situation, working on the situation in Iraq? It is a struggle for power, which we ought to be able to regard with more sophistication than we often do when we couch it in ancient religious terms of an ancient religious conflict.
So that's a mistake.
I think it is. I think at least it clouds our understanding of what can be done. They're a power. They want to be recognized. They want to be accepted as legitimate players, and they're not going to be excluded. And they can hurt us. Clearly, they can hurt us in Iraq today if they want to push up the temperature between the factions in Iraq and make it tougher for our eventual withdrawal from Iraq. They can do it.
We've got 30 seconds. What would you like to see within reasonable bounds? If you had the wish over the next year, and what do you expect to happen in the region? I know this is a huge question.
Well, I think doors are opening that we haven't seen move for the last few years, both in the Israeli-Palestinian situation and in a resolution of at least our role in Iraq. I don't know how Iraq is going to end up. I'm not that much of a crystal ball gazer. But there are opportunities by recognizing we have to work with everybody in the region. We can't exclude key players.
And you're coming back in your 3 to 4 months and explain to us why things happened that did?
No, to justify why they didn't happen. That's easier.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
Okay.